Now that we understood what the role of the star is, we can write our own structural directive. So let's create a new directive, and I will use the CLI for this. I will name it unless. So I will basically create the opposite of the ngIf directive. This directive here will attach something only if the condition is false. ngIf does it if the condition is true. So here I'll again delete the spec file here. And in the unless directive I get my selector, which is fine. Now here I need to get the condition as an input. So I'll add input. And remember, in the end we will use property binding with the squared brackets because Angular transforms it for us. We need to, of course, import input from @AngularCore. And then here I want to bind to a property named unless, which kind of simply is the condition we get. But whenever this condition changes, so whenever some input parameter here changes, I want to execute a method. And therefore I can implement a setter with the set keyword. This now turns this into a method, though technically, and that's important to understand, this still is a property. It's just a setter of the property, which is a method which gets executed whenever the property changes. And it of course changes whenever it changes outside of this directive. So whenever the condition we pass changes or some parameter of this condition. Unless therefore needs to receive the value the property would normally get as an input. And we know that this will be a Boolean because it will be our condition in the end. So we could also name this condition. Then we can check if the condition is not true, which is the case in which I want to display something, because unless is the opposite of ngIf. And if the condition is true, well, then I want to display nothing. So that is how we get the condition, how we use it, how do we display something. Keep in mind that our unless directive here in the end will sit on such a ng template component, because that is what it gets transformed to by Angular if we use the star. So we can get access to this template, and we also need to get access to the place in the document where we want to render it. Both can be injected. The template can be injected by adding template ref, any name you like, but the type is of type template ref. So just like element ref gave us access to the element the directive was on, template ref does the same for a template. And this is a generic type. You can simply pass any here. And we need to import template ref from @AngularCore. The second information piece we need is the view container. So where should we render it? The template is the what. Now the question is where. So I'll name it VCRef for view container reference. And the type is view container reference or view container ref, which is also imported from @AngularCore. That marks the place where we placed this directive in the document. Angular marks this place, and you can see this if you inspect it in the developer tools actually. So with these two tools available, we can use the VCRef whenever the condition changes to call the create embedded view method, which does just what the name implies. It creates a view in this view container. And the view simply is our template ref. So this template we created there is exactly this reference to the template there is exactly what we need. Well, and if the condition is true in this case, so if it's not what we are looking for, then we will simply call the clear method to remove everything from this place in the DOM. With that, our own directive is set up. Of course, we need to make sure that it is added here. The CLI did this for us. And now in the app component, we can use our own directive, maybe, to replace ngIf here. So I'll comment out all this stuff here and only copy the original div down there. Comment this in, of course. So here, instead of using ngIf, I'll use app unless. And the star is important because it still is a structural directive. Otherwise, we would have to manually write it with this ng template syntax you learned before. So here, of course, we don't want to check if only odd is false, because keep in mind the unless directive will check for the opposite already. So here we have to pass just only odd. And with this in place, we get that we can't bind to app unless because it's not a known property. Why do we get this? Can be really hard to track. We get this error because what we're trying to do is we have property binding here, custom property binding with add input. And we're binding a property named unless. Now keep in mind, the star automatically transforms this in this ng template syntax where we then try to property bind to the directive name, which is app unless. So we have to make sure that our property here shares the name of the directive, app unless, exactly the same as the selector. Now with this, it works fine. And as you can see, if I toggle here, we get the same behavior as before, even though I commented out the ngIf block and use my own app unless directive instead. So this is our own custom structural directive built. I want to conclude the section with one other built-in structural directive which might be handy from time to time, ng-switch. Imagine the case that we have a value like this, which is simply 10. Anything you want. Now we got a place in our app where this value changes. And we got a couple of different messages we want to display for each of these values. For this, we can use ng-switch. So let's add a new div here below our paragraphs with our own attribute directives. And ng-switched is used like this. We bind to ng-switch with property binding, so no star at this point, and we bind to value. So this is our condition basically, what we want to check. And then you might be aware that switch has a couple of cases we can now cover. So let's say we have a paragraph where we say value is 5, then we have the same for 10, then we have the same for 100, and maybe for default. Now we need to add something to these paragraphs to control which paragraph gets shown, because it should only be one of these at a time. That something is ng-switch case, and we simply pass the value for this case here as an argument, for example 5, and we need the star at the beginning. That's super important. So here the star comes into play again because behind the scenes this is then also transformed by Angular. So now we can use this here for the other two use cases too, with 10 and with 100. And finally for the default case, we have ng-switch default, like this. Now here we also need to add the star, of course. With this in place, if we save this, we only see 10 here. And if I go to my component and I change this to 5, like this, then of course we see 5. So this is ng-switch, super easy to use, might be useful in some cases where you find yourself creating a lot of ngIf conditions. ng-switch might be the better solution in such cases. So that is structural directives finished, and that is directives overall finished. You learned a lot about them, and I hope this knowledge allows you to create awesome directives for your applications in cases where the built-in ones aren't everything you need, even though these already cover a lot of the default use cases, to be honest. So let's move on. Let's add a directive to our recipe book in the next section, and then let's move on in the course. See you there.